One of the topics that really presented itself was the usage of contingent auto insurance in that space. When I say that space, we're talking about really 3PLs that are servicing the big and bulky area. Now, you guys are familiar with the big bulky space. That's 3PLs that are contracting with shippers like Lowe's, Home Depot, Best Buy, and they're bringing consumers' good over the threshold into the home, right? So there's installing washers, dryers, refrigerators, TVs, and they're using a contracting carrier network to do so. So the 3PL contracts with the shipper, and ultimately they contract with what they call a contracting carrier, an ICC, to bring those goods into the consumer's home. So that's the space, that's the model. These 3PLs are registered as licensed freight brokers in most cases because they're non-asset, and in most cases the ICCs are carrying their own motor carrier authority. So what I wanted to kind of talk about today was the various coverage forms that are out there when it comes to contingent auto liability, because from my perspective, when you really look at this class of business, I'm curious about things you have to say on this, Adam. They're a freight broker on paper, but in terms of their operation, I question, if these forms really apply to them. And the reason I say that is they're very involved in the risk, right? Most of them are managing the docks, for their particular shippers. They're using the same network, what they would call ICCs, over and over again, very hands-on with the operation. Whereas from my perspective, I envision a freight broker being somebody that's in an office, basically just negotiating the shipment between the shipper and the carrier, hanging up and moving on, right? That's not really how this class of business works. Some of them are even, signing agreements with particular shippers to lease their vehicles onto them, and then they sublease it to the ICCs. So you got a lot of different varying risks going on here, where a contingent auto form in a traditional sense for a truck broker maybe doesn't fit this class of business. What do you think about that, Adam, in terms of what you see on a coverage form?
Yeah, well, I think the first question becomes, are they stepping outside of that traditional definition of a freight brokerage, right? Traditionally a freight broker is basically, just they're in the middle. Their job is to basically arrange for the movement of freight by linking a manufacturer with a carrier for domestic carriage, right? They are much like you and I. They sit behind a desk, they work on computers and telephones, and they basically arrange for the movement of freight. And so, if they are stepping outside of that role, I mean, typically by definition, a freight brokerage is non-asset based, right? So when we begin talking about, leasing vehicles, leasing trucks, signing leasing agreements, I mean, these are big red flags that, any insured should be aware of. If you're now, becoming an asset-based freight brokerage, you're stepping outside of that traditional definition of a freight brokerage. And then the question becomes, has this risk been misclassified when presenting to a contingent auto liability insurance company, right? So that's one of the things I would be concerned about, really right off the bat.
Well, yeah, and I think it's a situation too. You hit it right on the head. How's it presented to the underwriter? Because ultimately, they show up as a licensed freight broker, and so one just assumes, okay, well, you've got freight broker authority. I'll use a contingent auto coverage form, and away we go. The problem is this class of business, they don't use tractors that a traditional truck broker might, right? Where those truckloads, that carrier has to have motor carrier authority in order to operate. These are box trucks, most of which are under 26,000 pounds GVW, and most of which aren't leaving the state, and so therefore could potentially not have to carry motor carrier authority, if at all. And so ultimately, you could have a situation where one of these ICCs presents itself as a motor carrier, shows you a COI that he has commercial auto insurance, but then ultimately elects to cancel his authority and place his coverage elsewhere with a cheaper insurer that is cheaper because they don't want to post the filing with the FMCSA, right? And so unless you're monitoring them, all the time for their proper MC authority, you could have a problem because correct me if I'm wrong, Adam, some of these coverage forms have restrictions as it relates to these, when you subcontract a load, they got to have proper motor carrier at the time of contract, as well as at the time of loss in order for coverage to apply. Is that not correct?
Yeah, so the vast majority of the policy forms and programs out there in the space do have a requirement that you, as the freight broker, you're doing certain things in order to vet your motor carriers, right? You should be consistently verifying that they have active authority before you're dispatching shipments to them, that they have insurance coverage in place at the time during which an accident may happen, right? So if you're not taking these steps, you might not be, satisfying certain conditions of your coverage form, and you may very well be in a situation where you're just uninsured for a loss, right? And ultimately that's part of our job, right? We need to make sure that we understand a client's business, we understand their business model, we understand what they're doing, who they're contracting with, what sort of contracts they're signing, and what sort of liability they're agreeing to, in order to then design an insurance policy that's going to provide them with the level of protection that they expect to have.